I decided to add a subtitle to the title that I had sent, and I thought it was useful to focus my attention on Mumbai, a city I know a little bit better than most others, and I've also been tracking what is happening there. So, and I've no, obviously the title itself makes it very clear, as does the abstract, that I'm interested in the a very interesting process of the fetishization, what looks like the fetishization of infrastructure. And I'm hoping today to show how that has, to not exactly show historically how that has happened. I can talk about it, but hopefully I will be able to illuminate some key dynamics at the core of it, um, providing some kind of theoretical elucidation. And as we go along, I'll add various remarks on the specifics of that transformation, that of, in a sense, the infrastructural transformation that is underway in Mumbai for the last 30 years. And here I'm very clearly focusing on transport infrastructure, because it has really completely transformed the space of the city, and also in many different ways transformed the people's living experience in very in diametrically opposite ways, you might say, uh, but not necessarily significantly improving the experience of living in the city for anyone. In fact, in many ways, even for the elite, um, increasingly we are hearing complaints about how unlivable the city of Mumbai has become. In fact, to the extent which probably is perhaps unprecedented, we recently had the chief secretary, who is the most powerful, the most senior bureaucrat in the state government, complaining in a public event that Mumbai city has become unwalkable for everyone. So this coming from a bureaucrat who, because of her position, is, or people like her are probably more likely to be traveling in cars all across the city, is very significant. And also, given the lack of any significant conversation, a significant public conversation between the state and uh, people living in the city about any of this kind of infrastructure, and the infrastructure building project. Um, and so therefore, clearly I give away my overall view, my takeaway of or evaluation of what has been happening in Mumbai in the subtitle. I do think that these are actually what a number of the if the infrastructure story of Mumbai is told a few decades later, it's very likely to read like some foibles that Mumbai has actually made. So there are four broad things I hope to speak about, and as I said, it's not going to be possible to actually trace the empirical development, and that's not really my interest today. I want to explore how we must think about infrastructure. Yeah. But before I go ahead, are you hearing a lot of disturbance in the background from my side? Okay, great. Because there's actually an infrastructure upgrade happening just outside my window. They have ripped apart the footpaths, and we are walking on the carriageways as always. So there's a very active excavator doing its work on a Saturday afternoon. Yeah, so there are four parts to the talk, and I'm not sure whether I'll get to talk much about the last part, though I've titled the talk to be about urbanism. But it's actually much more about the the problem, if I may say so, if I may call it so, of the fetishization of infrastructure. So there are four parts. The first, I'm going to talk of the infrastructural rush, and by the rush, I mean both. I mean it in both ways. There is a tearing hurry over the last 25, 30 years. In fact, there's been a tearing hurry to build and build and build and build a lot of things. Um, and that tearing hurry also seems to suggest that there is some kind of rush that um, some people are getting out of building all that infrastructure or thinking about building. And I may add that that rush is not entirely something that is probably experienced by those who commission it, the policymakers or I'm not sure about the planners. There are some interesting stories I have about those. But so it's not only those who, from the supply side, those who make those decisions, but it is also, to an extent, in my research, a rush that is shared by ordinary people, people whose lives in many ways may have become worse. They've certainly not improved structurally in any significant sense. But when they look at a flyover or a elevated road or metro construction, and they suffer for a decade as everything gets built all at the same time. There is this constant refrain when you talk about these things, saying, "Arey, but kuch to ho raha hai," something is happening. So there is that excitement somewhere about seeing so much happening, and you might it kind of resonates with the argument in the reading that I gave, the enchantment of infrastructure, where it's infrastructure is not so much is not only about what we think it is about, but it's also about the promise that it carries. And so then I want to speak a bit about why the rush. Going on to probe one answer, there are other reasons for this rush in the literal sense of building so much infrastructure, but specifically why are we getting high on infrastructure? Well, there is a kind of fetishization. And then finally, I'll leave you with some thoughts, a few images of what kind of urbanism we have uh, now created for ourselves. Urbanism in terms of an urban way of life and experience of the city, the everyday experience of the city, but also potentially a more structural, um, uh, say, pattern of urban life taken as a whole. So I want to begin with a few, these are instances from the past. So we built this about a decade ago. We built what you see on the left, which is a monorail, and which has been admitted to be a failure by the very parastatal, the state agency chaired by the chief minister, admitted to be a failure. And it's what is interesting about it is not that it failed, because it is it's entirely possible that you do something, you do all the studies, do all the due diligence, and you come up with some solution, and it fails. But what is interesting about it is it probably never had a chance of being successful in principle. And part of the reason was that this monorail, as a technology, when it was adopted or decided that we would build it, it had never been proven as a or ever been used at city scale. It was something that um, we know that you have such kind of technology being used at to connect two terminals in an airport in fairly small volumes. But here we are talking about a city in which the suburban railway carries something like 7 or 8 million trips every day. And the bus system, public bus system, carries anything between 3 to 4 million trips. And these kind of this elevated monorail was going to manage about maybe 100,000, if at all, right? That's what 150,000, I think, was to projected at. In actual practice, it was actually something like 1/10 of it at its best. So that was one misadventure. That was and a pretty expensive misadventure. But there is also a history which is historical example of what we had tried, which begins in the late 90s, which is a rush of building flyovers. And flyovers, as you know, are, in the US they call them overpasses. They're basically they take the traffic over an intersection to bypass the conflict, as it were. And as it happened, this was a decision not taken by the transport planners, but taken by the political leadership, along with the technocracy. In fact, this was taken against the uh, against the advice of the transport planners in the state itself. And it's interesting that huge project of building 50 flyovers across the city could be said to have succeeded. And we will come when we come to discussing why we build infrastructure. Um, by one reckoning, it was possibly even needed. But there, of course, the problem is that it's not a solution that um, can actually is forward is forward thinking, is not able to doesn't is lacks foresight, because a flyover what a flyover does is simply it just postpones the problem of congestion from one intersection to the next, and from this moment to the decade after. Because it's when you build a series of flyovers you across the city, you make navigating the city by car more attractive. You do nothing to, and of course, you don't do anything to reduce dependence on the car. And there you have induced travel, and you again it chokes. So this which is a very well-known phenomenon among transport planners, that's slowly what we are moving towards. But we are actually building more and more flyovers in more and more unlikely alignments. It's actually quite magical to when you read about another flyover coming between these two locations. I'm like wonderstruck, because I'm wondering how are they going to route this? Where is it going to go through? And sure enough, they have some land, maybe some state land or something else, maybe some natural areas over which they go. So that is the history, which probably has given a lot of confidence, because that really was a remarkable project. They built about 40 odd flyovers in the middle of an extremely dense and a city that literally never sleeps. They built those right in the middle of the city, a number of them, not all of them. And that perhaps also gave a lot of confidence. On the right of this slide, you also see the network of largely elevated metro lines. Only in the island city do you have underground metro lines, which is towards the south, the more privileged older parts of the city. Again, a recent report has shown that metros are, wherever they have been built in the country, they have not really worked as well as you would expect. The best performance has been in Delhi, where you only have 50% of the estimated ridership. Okay. So and now we have 10 lines of them. Yes, certainly, it's much better to have a metro network than maybe more and more of the car networks, which of course, at some point is something that the policymakers did realize, to their credit. But whether a metro is going to ever, how it will work, going by the example of other cities like Delhi, for instance, it's still quite a moot point whether it will really work, and exactly the extent of the work. And what's more interesting from an equity point of view is whether it will uh, prove to be a wise allocation of investment, uh, quite apart from something that really got my interest going in infrastructure, the effect it has on our living space. I'm an architect. I started relatively narrow, interested in what's happening to my street, and horrified that the sun has been blocked off in so many places. And then moving on to these broader questions. So apart from so there's the cost, but there's also the kind of irreversible loss of sun on the street, right? So that's something that we are now left with. Um, then, of course, there has been more recently. This is the future. If that was the past, this is the future. You have the new coastal road that is much of it is ready and some of it is functional, um, which was again not part of a the comprehensive traffic and transport study. It wasn't um, recommended as a particular project by the transport planners, by the report that is in a sense the blueprint for what should happen in the city. And yet, of course, it's been built. Interestingly, it's been built from the savings of the municipal corporation. 12, 13, about 15,000 crores, the numbers can change, being spent at one time. Remember also that at the same time as we are building this, the public bus service, the BEST, has been, uh, of course, suffering losses for almost decade and a half. And it's going further and further down. So we do have money for this, but we don't have money for the public bus service, which again, as I mentioned, had 3 to 4 million trips every day, and which partly tied into the bigger load carrier of trips, which is the railway system, but which is also public bus system also has its own independent service and routes. And on the right is what has been, which is fresh of the ovens, a new plan build, to use a technology that I have not had time to even begin to understand. This has been announced in September 2024, something called pod taxis, which I've never heard of. I'm sure they're there. I'm sure they're useful, but I don't know exactly in what way to connect some of the railway stations, suburban railway stations, to the most prestigious and more recently built Bandra Kurla complex. About 50 years ago, we began building it. So in the last 25 years, it's really taken off. Um, and this is to solve the last mile connectivity problem. When I first saw it, this news item, I was instantly reminded of the monorail, because again, the first question is, where does this come from? What exactly is the rationale that is driving us towards this solution? So these are the things that I've seen here happening in Mumbai, which I can see also playing out across the country in different ways. A student of mine a few years ago studied the first flyover that was built in Agartala, and where it wasn't clear that you had such a big problem of traffic congestion, and that this certainly was the best solution at all. So all of these developments were all across all cities, in fact, in Mumbai, big or small, we are seeing a proliferation of road transport infrastructure, including ring roads and wide road widening and flyovers, of course. And so this is really what's got me thinking about why exactly the rush. So clearly, um, there are a number of reasons. The more practical reasons, the most, shall I say, legitimate reason is that of need and demand. And there are the usual, especially with transport infrastructure, especially with roads, there is the argument, which is uh, which is certainly partly true. There is a important kernel of truth in it, which is that you need roads for to enable economic development. And clearly, that is the case, that you need people, labor, goods to be able to move, or to be you for us to be able to move those goods across distances. And um, there are, you need multiple modes, you need rail, you need road, and so on and so forth. So there is really no doubt we even have some kind of evidence of various kinds, perhaps, of roads actually improving economic, say, socioeconomic levels of villages, for instance. Um, and so there is that. And it's also, I mean, while there may be debates about, really is, there are debates among economists sometimes about whether the evidence holds, whether it's a straightforward equation. But yes, I think by and large, it's fair to say that we need roads. But the question often uh, that is not asked is, what is the overall demand? What is the overall need to begin with? And derived from that need as a market condition, demand, right? Um, for instance, again, coming to Mumbai, we find that almost at some point, almost half the population, half the trips undertaken in the city were by walking. Yeah. So if you were to even begin realistically looking at what people do and what they need, you would say that there are a lot of half the city's population is walking to work, which means they can't afford even the highly subsidized and cheapest form, which is the railway, um, in Mumbai. And that tells you something about that need and the possible demand that exists, which is how much can people really afford to pay? How much can the majority afford to pay? And from that, you can derive things like who are you catering for? Who should you cater for? How can you do that? And so on and so forth. There's, of course, a very simple answer to some of that, which is say, okay, make sure the city is walkable. So half the population is taken care of. But that has never been a significant priority. In fact, funnily enough, we're spending whatever 12, 15,000 crores on the coastal road, and we had allocated 200 crores for upgrading the pedestrian, the footpaths, and out of which 100 crores, I believe, were again taken out and put into the public bus service to hold it up. So clearly, there's a question of priorities where certain demands are prioritized over certain needs potentially. There's also, we know from the literature, a significant development over the last 50 years across the world, at least 50 years, where capital has moved from the secondary sector, from production, where, in the West especially, the returns have tended to stagnate, and costs have increased. So has moved from there into the sector of what Henri Lefebvre called the production of space, which is production of space as commodity. There are other kinds of production of space, but the production of space as commodity. And within that, uh, it has been argued that within that you include real estate production, the commodification of land, the building of buildings, and the commodification of space on the upper floors of buildings, not just land as a physical entity, but also the construction sector in general, including of building and operating various infrastructure. And that's where road and mobility infrastructure becomes very, very important, because obviously there is a lot of money to be made in building it. It's also, at the same time, it also offers a number of quick political benefits, um, which is connected to the question of the fetish that I will come to. But we know that internationally, there is a strong political economy around infrastructure, which means that, as Ben Fliberg, who's studied infrastructure and mega projects for many decades, has argued and shown that he studied, I think, 256 mega projects in the Western world, the developed world only, the America, US, Japan mainly, uh, projects over $1 billion. And he found that he came to the conclusion that the benefits of infrastructure projects, mega projects, have been systematically overestimated, and their costs have been systematically underestimated. Systematically means A, it holds across a large number of all majority of cases, and it is also, there is reason to believe that it was known to the proponents, whether it may be the consultants or the government technocrats as well as the politicians, that this was overestimation and underestimation respectively. So that has been an important feature. So that we can assume to be operational in Mumbai and in India too. And what really clinches it is the possibility of fetishizing infrastructure, which also explains, which is part of the rush we feel of what I have elsewhere called white space, a particular uh, idea and ideal of what our urban spaces should be like, which is patterned on colonial and contemporary Western ideas of the good city, which is largely a kind of visual spatial imagination. And I call it white space because I think that kind of conceived space, as Lefebvre would call it, is also is a racialized space. It's a very white space in that racialized sense. I won't go into white space here, but the fetishization, the possibility of fetishization is something that enables this political economy also to function. Here, it's a good detour to go to John Turner, who pioneer of a more humanistic approach to thinking about housing, who said that what a house does is more important than what it is. And this is an argument against thinking of the house as an output, as a product, and thinking of, okay, I built 100,000 houses. Against thinking like that, he suggests that, and that house that I say is a good house is defined in terms of its physical qualities. Instead, he says even a little shelter which doesn't meet your standard has actually enabled this family to get ahead in life. So it's fundamentally an argument against the fetishization of the house as a built object. And infrastructure, we should remember before we get into thinking of the fetish, infrastructure is always a kind of dependent. It's a dependent, you might say, determination, if you want to call it that, which is to say that infrastructure is not absolute. It is always of some other activity. So it is impossible to talk meaningfully about infrastructure without looking at what other activity it is enabling. And for that reason, by that definition, you can have, both public buses being thought of as infrastructure or water supply, as well as people, as Abdul Malik Simon has said, people as infrastructure, that they enable certain other things and other activities to happen. And it's also not just hardware. It's not just the concrete thing, whether it's underground or overground. It is in practice. It is the infrastructure that is practiced, that it is working. Otherwise, it's just simply a ruin, which also means that, the whole management, finance, contracting, all of those dimensions become very, very important, and the actual working. And also important to remember that it's a relatively new term as a very commonly used term. It starts coming into the public discourse only in the 90s, and it is brought in there consciously so that to replace the concept of public works. Why? To enable private invest, to enable the discursive grounds for private investment for infrastructure to then be seen legitimately as something that is an avenue of private investment and, of course, profit making. So in this, in the reading I gave you of about the fetishization of the modern city, Swingdao and Kaika, they quote Marx. And it's a very interesting quote, because what he says is that in this world, So if you read the first few bit, the core, the central line is that in this world, the productions of the human brain, which is basically what we produce as human beings, these bridges and things, they appear as independent beings endowed with life and entering into relation both with one another and the human race. Okay? And which he calls fetishism. Uh, so one of the things that it does is the process through which the commodity form, they're talking of something slightly different but related here, and I'll show you, talk about the connections, where the form of existence is severed from its historical and geographical process of production. When you enjoy a beautiful cell phone and you're very happy to have bought it, your joy requires that you don't know, or at least don't take seriously, the oppression and the terrible conditions of mining for what, coltan or something, right? The important element, an important mineral, which is available only in Congo, yeah, where there's child labor is used in mining under horrific conditions. So that's one example of the actual conditions, the overall socio environmental metabolism through which something is produced. So in the case of infrastructure, what we see is that there is a fetishization of, I suspect, of the physical form, of of that, say, the elevator, the flyover, where its actual workings and connections in the way the real city or economy works is simply, obscured. Yeah. And what is also obscured is the place of this flyover or this elevated metro or the underground metro, whatever, in the in the whole mesh of real needs and the real economies. Okay? And therefore, from what exactly it is doing in relation to those real needs and those real um, economies of the city. So it's almost like the infrastructure is basically becoming a kind of magic. There is a kind of magical thinking that we see when we have put our faith in the flyover to solve our transport problems without actually understanding the transport problems or the realities on the ground, and arriving at the right solution from it. In fact, you can think of it as solutions in search of problems. We already have the answer that we need to have this system because it's worked in fancy places, and that's why we are going to use it here. And with flyovers, or with any of these more visible infrastructure, it's not just like on the Swingdao and Kaikas say that putting the water underground has made those relations, so metabolic relations, invisible. But I would argue that with transport infrastructure, it doesn't matter whether you are underground or overground. That little bit of physicality that you see is enough, and both are enough to sever the bond with the entire process in which it is placed. So what we are therefore seeing is a inability or an unwillingness, really, because of the fact that there's a political economy in place which probably is driving everything, but also because of the shared fetishization of infrastructure, both from the suppliers as well as those on the demand side, that it never, that the calculus of actual, say, number of trips in transport versus between one mode, a more sort of low prestige mode like the suburban rail, and another which is a more elite mode like the metro, that weighing of the scales one against the other in relation to also the investments to be made in it is not something that's happening, because an elevated or underground metro is many times more expensive than, say, a suburban rail, and even more expensive than, say, a bus rapid transit system. Interestingly, bus rapid transit systems, which is something that we should have invested in developing as a system, have simply, almost been left to die some kind of death, though in many ways they are perhaps the best solution we have, but they don't involve a lot of visible monumental infrastructure. So they are not exciting. That's perhaps one reason. And of course, then they don't attract a particular kind of political economy of rent seeking around them. So this is what has taken us to a particular kind of urbanism. And I'll close with a few thoughts about this urbanism. Um, so this is a just one moment from hundreds of very different situations in Mumbai that the flyovers have given us. This is what you're seeing in the background is one part of an elevated freeway called the Eastern Freeway, which I have benefited tremendously personally because it's really connected me to the old core of the city, like in a jiffy, but which is a completely meaningless kind of transport intervention, except if we believe that only elite mobility is something that urban planning and infrastructure has to make easier. Um, but what is also interesting for me is how this this has uh, been engaged by a particular kind of nativist politics and its symbolism. And you had these largely fiberglass um, fort fort set that has been built around this, with, of course, a statue of Shivaji and a real stone built replica of some kind of, fort on the ground. Um, and here, of course, we see perhaps a double fetishization, not just a fetishization uh, of infrastructure, but also perhaps of a particularly important but historical figure who comes with a range of other, you know, possibilities that have been very quickly erased in many ways. And I leave you with this image, which is not more than 3 or 4 kilometers away. In fact, if you take the freeway takes you very quickly to the place where this is located. If you just go off um, the path, that the freeway continues on, and this is on the edges of a well-known resettlement colony that became that is now thought of as an informal settlement or slum called Shivaji Nagar. So this is not in Shivaji Nagar, but it is in Rafi Nagar, which is so Shivaji Nagar was a resettlement colony, but it's not really fully built up. It was just pitches 10 feet by 15 feet marked on a marsh next to the biggest dumping ground landfill site in Mumbai in the 70s, early 70s, when people from many parts of Mumbai, South Mumbai especially, which is the more poor, older part of Mumbai, were moved um, in a place that had no connectivity at that point, and they somehow kind of made a life on that marsh by filling in that marsh and making it habitable, building a thick, dense city within a city. So in about 1.1 square kilometers, you have anywhere between 4 to 8 lakh people living. That is a kind of density. But on the edges of that, which is at least in some way a formal settlement, semi-formal, if you would like it, you have this, in which what you see in the center of the picture is infrastructure. This is a toilet that people have built because they don't have access to any public toilet. There's nothing built. And they're now on the edges of the settlement. You are in the creek, basically. And this is a toilet people have built for themselves. And this is really, in many ways, the infrastructure that is more sorely missing. We are still able to get by. We have enough roads to travel on, but we don't have toilets to go along with people and families. So, in many ways, you could say that the majority of the city is needs infrastructure like this, okay? And exactly all the money is really going, and all the attention. It's not just a question of money; it's also a question of the attention, all the expert attention, the administrative attention, even the popular and media attention is on a very different set of infrastructural provisions, which have their place in some kind of vision of the future, but perhaps not as significant as they ought to be. So I'll end here. Thank you.